Welcome back, folks. Hope you're having a great week. You may be wondering why I'm sitting all the way at the end of my layout instead of in my usual spot in the center. This is where you're used to seeing me, right? This is the comfort spot. Well, that's because tonight we're going to talk about the layout benchwork. Now, what does benchwork mean? Benchwork is essentially the wooden table structure that holds up the track and the scenery and everything that you see behind me. And I wanted to do a video on this some time ago, but I kept procrastinating and we kept doing fun train engines. But the main focus of this video is to talk about the construction process from design to build of the 10 tables that make up this 27-foot by 12-foot table that you see behind me. This should be a lot of fun. Sit back, relax, and enjoy. The story of my train layout started a long time ago, but really came to fruition in the fall of 2020. I had been setting up my track and I would arrange it on the floor in my basement. The time finally came for me to build the table. But I'm not much of a woodworker. I don't have a lot of those skills, and I was looking at the track plan on the floor and how it had the reverse dog bone shape and all the wood that it was going to take and all of the tables, and it was going to have to be really flat. And, I think anyone who's built a train layout knows what I'm talking about. There's a lot that goes into getting all these tables together. So what did I do? I found a friend. My good friend Lawrence is really into woodworking. Woodworking to him is what trains are to me. So I laid my track out on the floor and I gave Lawrence a call and I said, would you be willing to come over and take a look at a project I'm considering doing? I want to make a little train layout of my basement. So in comes Lawrence, he comes over, walks into the basement, and he looks at the track on the floor, and he says,
I thought you said this was a little train table.
But I think Lawrence was up to the challenge. I think something about this excited him in such a way where he said, okay, I'll help you, Chris, we're going to do this. The first step of the layout construction process was to take measurements of the basement and the layout. This included the overall width and height, as well as measuring the challenging element of the fireplace hearth. I've had a lot of questions about the fireplace. It was capped and sealed before I moved in. To add length, the benchwork would be built right up against the fireplace to maximize the use of space in the room. And the bricks on the hearth would also be used to support the edges of the benchwork. After the survey, Lawrence generated a CAD design showing 10 tables, the framing, and the leg positions. This provided enough information to estimate material, so it was time to head to the store. The layout would require a total of 14 sheets of plywood. This includes 8 sheets of 1/2 inch plywood, 5 sheets of 3/4 inch plywood, and 1 sheet of 1/4 inch plywood. The plywood made its way back to the shop and was cut down into smaller rectangular sections to be placed on the floor underneath the track. The next step was to trace the track to get the rounded edges of the tables. To accommodate for larger articulated engines, we used our friend, the Union Pacific Big Boy 4014, to determine the gap. Boiler articulation had to be factored into the design so that we didn't risk the engine overhanging or hitting the walls or any of those other things that can happen with larger engines. To make our trace, we used a compass and set it to about 1.5 inches. The edge of the track was then traced to get our line. Once the tables were traced, the plywood was packed back up and made its way back to the shop for the fun part. The next step in the process was to construct the table legs. The 10 tables would require a total of 35 table legs to support. To do this, the plywood was ripped down into strips and cut at an angle for assembly. So each table leg was actually made out of plywood. The legs were then glued, clamped, and taped. Once dry, the tape was removed and the legs were ready for the next step. Now, I have 3 small children, and I knew that they were going to use the layout as a fort or a campground. Sometimes they sleep under here, sometimes they read under here, or sometimes it's just a good hiding spot. It's also a good place for me to hide. But I wanted to make sure that I minimized any rigid or sharp edges underneath the layout. To do this, a 45-degree angle was cut into the corner of each table leg. This provided a safer design and a more finished look. We're going to call that a win. Proceed to sanding, and now you have a smooth table leg. But we're still not done. To increase the attachment points and structure, gussets were built. The gussets were then cut at a 45-degree angle again, to reduce the risk of anyone bumping their head on the bottom of the layout, even though I still do that all the time. I think I got like 6 bumps on my head right now just from crawling under the layout. The final touch on the legs were the addition of end caps on each leg. This maximizes floor contact with my carpeted floor. More sanding commenced at this point. That's me. This is like the one thing I actually did. Lawrence did the rest. He really did. I didn't do much here. Once the sanding was finished, the gussets were attached, and it was time to stain the wood. The legs made the journey back over to my house and into the garage, where I used a polyurethane finish to each of the 35 table legs. There were so many fumes. I'm never going to get those brain cells back. The next phase of construction was the understructure, or framing, that would be used to support the table surfaces. We used the 3/4 inch plywood for the structure. The plywood was ripped down into 2 1/4 inch strips that would be used for the framing. The idea for this structural approach came from the microlam beams that are used in most of the modern residential homes. These are rigid, strong, and resistant to any warping, which is the big thing. When the table's going to sit here over time, it could get subjected to humidity or different changes in temperature. We want the table to stay flat and sturdy for a
long time.
Once all of the strips were cut, it was time to start on the first table. Each table surface was constructed using the 1/2 inch plywood. The first table that you're seeing here is the largest, and it was also the easiest to cut because it was mainly a rectangle with one curved edge. Once the table was cut, plywood strips were then cut and glued into place. Anchor points were cut using a pocket hole jig so that the 3/4 inch strips could be secured to the 1/2 inch plywood top. To accommodate the first angle, a small piece of fir wood was used and it was cut at an angle. The remaining tables all use a laminated method, which we're going to see in just a moment. And wow, the first table was done. You can see there I am again, holding it up like I actually did something. To test the strength of the table, there he is, the legend, Lawrence. Again, we can't thank Lawrence enough during the entire process and for taking these great pictures. Now, we're not going to sit here tonight and detail the remaining 9 tables. That would take forever, and it would put all of us to sleep. But let's highlight some of the challenges, because there were a couple of challenges that were encountered, especially due to the curved edges. The second table was one of the smallest tables, but required a very large curved edge. This table actually sits up on the north end of the layout on the corner of the area that I call Addison. To accommodate the edge, the structure was cut into ribbing to provide attachment points for the laminated curved trim. And the curve was achieved by laminating 3 pieces. Each was applied separately, attached, and then glued. Once all 3 were in place, clamps were set in place to hold the structure while the glue cured. Pretty cool, huh? Once dry, the clamps were removed and the edges were cleaned for that finished look. The next table was a bit of a challenge because it required unique curves on each side. You can see the S curve on the one side and the rounded curve on the other. Additional ribbing was then applied to increase support of the laminated edges. This is one of the trial and error things that we learned throughout the process. The same method was used to apply the 1/4 inch strips, and the wood was clamped into place. These first tables rounded out the area of the layout right behind me that we call Addison. So this area you're looking at is 1, 2, 3 tables on the other side that make this section of the layout. Sturdy. The next 2 tables make up the long section of the layout and support the yard area. Each table requires a curved edge to transition to the north and the south ends of the layout. Once the yard tables were completed, that wrapped up half of the table. You can see this photo. Here are the first 5 tables sitting in the shop, ready to go. At this point, the construction process was pretty much a well-oiled machine. Pun intended, trains. Tables 6 and 7 round out the bottom area of the layout, or the south end. This is the part that goes right up against that chimney, that fireplace hearth area. These tables required some notches that would allow them to set in to the fireplace hearth. The notches weren't that big of a deal. It was the concaved angles that again required lots of ribbing and the laminated finish. These tables would also require shorter legs as they would be supported by the bricks on the fireplace. The process for the structure continued to take some time because the framing outlines had to be drawn on each piece, as you're seeing here. And as you can see, there was a lot of structure. Park a tank on that thing. A couple more hours of work and the remaining tables were completed. The completed tables were then loaded into the truck and came here to my basement for assembly. This leads us to the final step, assembly. That was a fun day when Lawrence gave me the call and said, I want these tables out of my shop. I'm coming over. Once the tables were loaded in, they were flipped upside down and the legs were placed using clamps. This was a temporary solution so that we could flip the tables over, make sure they were level, put them into position, and then anchor the gussets to the bottom of the structure. Using an 8-foot plywood strip and a really big level, each table was set into place and then leveled across the surface to make sure everything was completely flat. Once we confirmed that everything was level, the legs were secured. This process took nearly 6 hours to complete. And here is the finished table. I was so happy with how it turned out, and I am still eternally grateful to Lawrence for all of his help with this, for sharing his time and his talents. All in all, the 27-foot by 12-foot layout took 60 hours to complete, and I learned a ton by watching Lawrence throughout this process. The table is solid, flat, and perfect for the track and scenery that has since been installed. I hope you enjoyed this little overview of the layout, and maybe you learned something about how the benchwork was built. Maybe you got ideas for your own, or maybe there's things we should have done differently. I don't know. Leave me a comment. Let me know what you think. As always, a huge thank you to all of my subscribers and everyone who's been supporting this channel. My name is Chris, and this is RBP Trains. We'll see you next time.